for staying around, and well, of course, there's wine after this, so that's the incentive, I guess. This is a panel on Internet for All. We have tremendous complexity in California around who has and doesn't have access to broadband internet. I think people outside of California tend to look at the urban areas and figure that that's problem solved, and don't recognize that California is a rural state and has far-flung populations in geographically complex places. And so the folks to my left here are all working on this in various ways, and I thought it would be interesting to have a panel where we had folks from public sector and private sector address this question, because I think there are really innovative things going on in both arenas, and there's a high degree of collaboration in the state, I think far beyond what goes on in a lot of states, between and among all the folks who are up here on the panel. So what I want to do is introduce them in no particular, not in the order they're seated. Dane Jasper here is the co-founder and CEO of CENIC, which is a facilities-based telecommunications, backhaul, and internet access company. He's led CENIC with over 24 years of industry experience in all aspects of data and voice networks. And he's got extensive experience in wireline, copper, and fiber optic networks. I want to tell you, Dane and I were in Sonoma, a couple months ago, and having a meeting there. And they do some pretty extraordinary stuff where they're delivering fiber to the home and doing gigabit symmetrical services. And he was telling me about this. And the next day, I got my robe on and I'm having my cup of coffee, and there's a knock at the door. And it's one of his, where we live in Berkeley, and they've expanded into Berkeley and Oakland and so on. There's a knock at the door, and there's one of his young, enthusiastic salespeople. She said, "I'm from CENIC," and I said, "No, sold." And she said, "No, wait, let me tell you." And I said, "No, where do I sign?" So anyway, they've been a really effective company. While we're on the private sector side, if I can find your bio here. Otherwise, I'll make it up, Sklyer. Sklyer Ditchfield. He is the co-founder and CEO of GeoLinks. And most of you here at the lunch awards ceremony, so you know that we have given GeoLinks an award for their work in fixed wireless, allowing us to reach schools and libraries and agricultural UC agricultural natural resource sites, the research sites around the state that have had little or no capacity. Many of them are, as I said, on dial-up, and it's been a game changer for some number of dozens of institutions, with a bunch of them currently in the works. So a great partner for CENIC. Down at the end, next to the end, Kim Lewis works for CENIC, and she's our legislative advocate, or on other days, our lobbyist. And she's been our consultant in this arena for the past 7 years. She's a point of contact with the governor's office, with the legislature, and with the California Public Utility Commission. And she's on the ground in Sacramento and has really been a driving force for us to get additional funds for adding libraries to the CENIC network, which was the tremendous project, but also getting $76 million to do last mile connectivity to schools, for keeping us engaged in all kinds of public policy matters in front of the state legislature, some of which are very beneficial, some of which the object of her work is to have nothing happen. And success means silence. And so she's been very, very effective in that arena. To my left is Sunne McPeak, and I could probably talk all day about Sunne and her accomplishments. She's the president and CEO of the California Emerging Technology Fund, and it's a statewide nonprofit organization whose mission is to close the digital divide by accelerating the deployment and adoption of broadband. And I want to also note the last part of that, the adoption of broadband, because sometimes from our perspective is, you just build it and it'll work. And it turns out that in some communities it's not that easy. They have to have a reason. Communities have to have a reason to want to have access to broadband. CETF has been a phenomenal partner to CENIC, and Sunne has done all kinds of things. She was Secretary of California Business and Transportation Housing Agency, so she was a cabinet-level secretary in both a Democratic and a Republican administration. And she oversaw things like our Department of Transportation, big things, Department of Transportation and so on. She was in politics at the local level in Contra Costa County and has done myriad things. We like to say that she's another force of nature. Just in the middle here, Rachelle Chong is a principal of the law offices of Rachelle Chong in San Francisco. She was a commissioner on the FCC during the Clinton era. She was a commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission under Governor Schwarzenegger. Note again, somebody who's worked in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And she was special counsel for advanced services and communications for the California Technology Agency. She says that one of her proudest moments was establishing the California Public Utility Commission's California Advanced Services Fund, which was the first state broadband infrastructure fund to provide grants to companies who agreed to build broadband infrastructure to areas without internet in California. And it's been tremendously important to, we work with private sector partners over the years who do the building, but our constituents benefit from this. And in this area, in the Monterey Bay Peninsula, we had such a project funded by the PUC that really changed the availability of broadband to, you're in Monterey and maybe you went over to Carmel. Well, this peninsula is not all Monterey and Carmel. There are a lot of communities that are not as well off, and so historically hadn't had services. This build helped get services to them. It helped us get better services to community colleges, to county offices of education. We're involved with healthcare on the peninsula, as well as to our neighbor to the north, UC Santa Cruz, tremendously important to them. So with that, I'm going to ask each of them to just say a few words, and then we'll have some questions, and you can, whatever order you're comfortable doing this. Sunne, maybe you want to start?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Louis. And let me start by saying that you, Louis, have been a great personal ally, and CENIC has been a great partner. And you mentioned sort of the culture of collaboration in California. You and I know we need a whole lot more of that, but to the extent that it is a hallmark in this space of deploying digital networks and digital inclusion, CENIC has been a pioneer. So to you and your co-chairs, Tom and Patrick, and the CENIC board, you have provided a pathway and been the trailblazer in collaboration. CENIC is actually a pretty unique organization that is serving the public interest and not government controlled or actually entitled. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, on this panel, Louis already said that Kim is a wizard at representing representing CENIC and helping us along the way in the legislature. Rachelle Chong is this unique person who served on the FCC and the PUC and is our special counsel. So in the interest of full disclosure, and having Sklyer and Dane as entrepreneurs who can be not only breakthrough strategies, but also disruptors in at a time when we need it in this industry. This is a true honor to get to serve with you. So the challenge in California is not small. Let me just take a sort of a sense of how many people here in this room are not from California. And I know, Vaughn, you're from Oklahoma, the Okie from Muskogee. Okay. So those of you who are just visiting, you have no idea how diverse our geography is. Our geology in trying to build anything, let alone now add everything else on top of that, the diversity of our populations, the complexity of our politics, and now we're going to try to do something that nobody wants to get done who's in power, which is let's get high-speed internet access to all households, and let's get everybody online. And so that is what actually the Public Utilities Commission in California charged our organization with doing in reaching a voluntary agreement with SBC when they purchased AT&T in 2005 and Verizon purchased MCI. To this farm girl, $60 million is a hell of a lot of money, but California is a big damn state. And so we set out to articulate strategies that could achieve those goals. We came close in a decade. We're so far from where we need to be, but we are about at 97.5% deployment. We set a goal of 98% deployment. We are at adoption, that is the use of any device at home to access the internet with higher speed. We are at 87% adoption, but 18% of that is a smartphone only, and that's very challenging for students to do their homework, for adults to get their workforce skills. The challenge for us is going to be how do we actually strike a balance in both a legal framework and regulatory implementation of that to, we hope, forge even deeper, sincere partnerships with companies, the larger, the smaller entrepreneurs, and get deployment where we need it at speeds far greater than we have in most places in California, and to recognize applications such as Robert C. or Gabe would tell us our agricultural industry in California really would benefit well if we had signals into the fields. All of our tribal lands, we have 109 federally recognized tribes in California. More Native Americans live in California than any other state. And they are the most remote lands, wherever Matthew is, if he's in this room. The tribal village in San Diego, has been trying to get broadband deployed to their residents. They have as much of a power problem as an infrastructure for internet problem, just accomplishing that. And then we've had a few little disasters lately in California, wildfires, the threat of dams breaking, and being able to have adequate emergency response is a huge issue for us. So we sponsored a bill called the Internet for All Now Act. And halfway through the process, I had to oppose the bill I was sponsoring because it was hijacked by large incumbents, and rules barely got back, or provisions back, to the point where we could agree to get a bill signed by the governor, passed and signed by the governor. I want to stop by or conclude by saying we hope we have an opportunity in California and working with CENIC to actually, in the next 5 years, have huge accomplishments, Louis. And for those of you who are not from California, we want to borrow all of your experience, all of the brain trust here to figure out how to do it better.
Thank you, Sunne. My name is Dane Jasper, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sonic Telecom. And we're a competitive broadband access provider, primarily focused on building fiber-to-the-home networks and delivering gigabit symmetric service to residential consumers. And the opportunity and the challenge that we see is not limited to California, but most American households have two choices of broadband, or 0 or 1. And when it comes to fast access, 50, 100 megabits or more, they generally speaking have 1 or 0. And that is an outcome of regulatory policy, decision-making by the FCC in the early 2000s around deregulation in an attempt to get cable companies and telephone companies to invest in their networks, but creating in the process what is effectively an intentional duopoly, which has left American broadband consumers paying far more for their internet access, and from an equity perspective, availability is not uniform and costs are not uniform. So if you look at American internet access in OECD data about what people pay for internet access in developing and first world nations, Americans pay far more than any other developed nation on a price per megabit basis. And that is because, in my opinion, you're working with a duopoly or an oligopoly situation. That really excites me because it's an opportunity. As a commercial business, we build new infrastructure into neighborhoods, and it's very well received. And I think it was an interesting example and entirely coincidental that we literally showed up at your house when you were in your bathrobe the next morning, the day after our meeting. That really was a coincidence because I don't know where he lives, and you immediately said, "Yeah, sign me up," and that's the kind of response that we get. In many cases, people are very frustrated by the service provider options that they've had. Long-term commitments, teaser introductory pricing, challenging bundles, complexity in the products. And so cable in general is sort of the company that Americans love to hate most. And so our focus is on building new infrastructure in communities, new optical infrastructure, modern, reliable infrastructure. And part of our approach is to partner with schools and libraries. If you're building a residential access network out into neighborhoods, that neighborhood will have a primary, elementary, or middle school. If we can aggregate, dark fiber or 10 gigabit service to schools, if we can aggregate municipal uses, so cities may want Wi-Fi in a park, or they may need a security camera at an intersection. They may need to monitor, water reservoirs or other systems. And so municipalities have a role to play. And then we also serve enterprise. So if we're on our way to a neighborhood, we will build infrastructure down a commercial corridor. And ideally, we want to capture as many of those enterprise users as possible as well. And in the process of aggregating all those applications, we drive down the cost of deployment effectively for those residential consumers. And so when we show up in a neighborhood, we're offering a 1 gigabit symmetric product, which we sell for $40 monthly. And we bundle it with an unlimited nationwide telephone service and unlimited calling to 66 countries. So it's the fastest, cheapest internet and phone service in America. And our goal is to bring that to as many communities as we can through partnerships with community organizations, municipalities, schools and libraries, and marketing to the public.
Louis, request permission to raise hell for a minute. Thank you. Okay, so I'm the serial regulator. I'm sorry about that. But I've been listening to the K-12 community that's been here, and I heard a lot of sad stories. I just came from the Navajo Nation presentation, which was really, really sad. And so Sunne hit it on the head. You can't have broadband without electricity. They don't have kitchens. They don't have bathrooms. So more or less electricity, which then gets you broadband. But I digress. Okay, so what can you do? Let's start at the beginning. The problem is money. There is inadequate money being spent on broadband infrastructure to the rural, tribal, and sometimes even suburban areas. And that is a factor of the FCC failing to put enough money in the Connect America Fund. So what do you do about that? You talk to your Congress member as your anchor institution, and you complain bitterly about it and tell them to get the heck off their hiney and get you adequate money for broadband. Okay? So that's the first thing you do. Call your Congress member. Second, you talk to your local government official, because they will help you complain up to your state senator and your state assembly member, because there is a secondary fund that also comes from the California PUC, and the California legislature passes on that. Sunne just fought an incredible battle last year, and it was ugly, 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 where we were pitted against large incumbent operators with full-time lobbyists, hordes of them, against a bunch of well-meaning community people like you who were just trying to get broadband to rural school kids so they could do their homework, right? And it was really ugly. But we got $330 million. There are restrictions on it, unfortunately, that favor the incumbents for a little while. But we also got, amazingly, $20 million for the first time for digital literacy programs. And I'm mentioning that because I know there's a bunch of schools and libraries here. So the PUC has just put out a rulemaking to give out the $20 million in California. And I read the rules this morning. They're fairly baked because they have to accept the first application by July 1st of this year. So essentially, if you're a school, a public library, a community-based organization, a local government, a nonprofit organization, you can apply for a grant from the PUC to do two things: digital literacy programs or public access to the public of computers. So if you do a program that is $50,000 or less, you will get expedited treatment. And they have it's good for the actual devices. So $1,000 for a big, community access device like a computer, PC. Or you get $250 for like tablet or Chromebook type devices. They include desks, they include the instruction, they include the teacher, they include outreach. So, it looked like you could do some stuff with that. So I just wanted to put that on your radar screen. It's the California Advanced Service Fund, the digital literacy grants, going to come up July 1st, and it's good for, whenever the money runs out, but it's going to go for about 4 years. They're going to process them every 6 months. Schools and libraries are eligible. Okay? Second thing, the PUC's map and the FCC's broadband map really stinks. And the reason is as follows. The providers report the data, and it's a big area, census block group. And if one person is served by broadband in that area, they can claim that it's served. And so the map is wrong. And so if you're in a rural area or even a suburban area, a lot of times they claim that you're served and you're really not. So what can you do about that? What you can do about that is, I want you guys to go back to your constituents, so your school kids, your library patrons, and I want them to pull out their mobile phone, and there's a Cal Speed app that the PUC has developed. Cal Speed, please write that down. And we want you to go out and ground source the real speeds that you're getting all over California in your areas. Because until we fix that data with the ground truthing using this app, we can't prove to the PUC that it's not served, and therefore we can't get these grants to improve the service to these areas. It's as simple as that. So that's what I had for today. I have lots of knowledge inside my brain about the FCC and the PUC, but I wanted to pick things that you could help me with. But I'm an asset to you guys. I'm a resource. I have a couple clients on the panel, and they know that I drop everything and help anybody that needs to get broadband because I really believe in it. So thanks.
And we love it when you're raising hell. That's my job.
I'm Kim Lewis, as Lewis kindly pointed out, and a lot of my work with CENIC, and part of it is you're all here and you know CENIC. But the thing is, with a lot of people at the California State Legislature, PUC, and others, may have not heard of CENIC before. You guys hear about it when your presidents want to know why the wireless is not working on your campus and something's wrong, and then they figure out how to find you as the CIO or, tech person who's in charge for the day. And so it's our job to really educate them on what the value is for the network and how research and education networks are different and the needs of it are different. Because a lot of members look at it as, well, I have a cell phone, I have access at home, I'm just going to call my cable guy, he's going to come in and put it in a box and a hole in the wall and we're good to go. Isn't that what you need as a school, as a library, as a research facility? And not understanding the difference between enterprise networking versus residential networking. And what we see is we have our anchor institutions and members, schools and libraries, and community colleges and our off-site centers and others that don't have access and are having a hard time and challenge getting that high-speed broadband that we need. And what we realize is it's not just an issue of you as an educational research institution, it's that community. The infrastructure that's in the ground is lacking and it's missing. So what do our folks do when they go home after working all day and need to do this to do their homework as school kids? We had the opportunity to get some attention of the legislature because we were rolling out things like online assessments for school kids and asking members of, well, how are you going to do this? And their questions to me were like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, how are you going to do this? Like, you realize some schools don't actually have adequate connectivity currently. And it was mind-blowing for them. So that's kind of really the role of CENIC, is to elevate issues and priorities and bring it to the attention of members who don't think about it, because that's not the world that they live in. It's not the world that they experience. So how do we bring the value and added information that the collective of you, CENIC, can add to the conversation to make it more informed, to make it more educated, and create that value that's needed in a community? Louis talked about the local project here of connecting Santa Cruz, Monterey, Salinas area, and that took a unique opportunity with federal ARA infrastructure funding. And there's a potential for some new infrastructure funding coming out from the federal government, when and whatever that may look like. And do we want to miss that opportunity to see additional investments be made in California for infrastructure to build the needs to ensure that we can meet the outcomes for education and research, as well as that has that secondary benefit of impacting and supporting the community and those people who work at those institutions when they go home and their neighbors? So there's a lot of opportunities that happen. And so, it's really trying to bring your voices to these different people who make decisions for you and pass laws and pass regulations and decide what's of value in their mind. And so it's really about bringing that voice ahead to the attention of everyone and to really help better it. California is unique because we do have a lot of variety of universal service programs that other states don't have. We talk a lot about federal E-rate, which is oversubscribed. There's not enough funding for that at the federal level. But we have a similar program here in California, the California Teleconnect Fund, which it benefits schools, libraries, and even community colleges, which is unique compared to federal E-rate. And so California has always been at that forefront of doing things that are different. So when we do have things like an adoption program, I let our partners know at the libraries and schools about, hey, here's an opportunity, heads up. This may not be your primary everyday job, but hey, I want to let you know that this is out there, and if this is something you're interested in, you need to get involved now. Because that's the value add of being a community of people who can connect and do shared resources and help each other out. So I'll stop with that right now.
Thanks. I'm Sklyer, Ditchfield, CEO of GeoLinks, and we are a fixed wireless internet provider, as mentioned previously. This issue, first of, like Sunne, Rachelle had introduced me to Sunne, I think a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, on the AB 1665 bill, which was replenishing all this funding, and Rachelle and I took a trip up to Sacramento to help lobby for that, and it was very eye-opening to me. It was my first time doing that, in finding out the misinformation that our legislators had in regards to the internet connectivity, and that they were being pitched these stories that 4G or 5G was going to be the solution for these areas, and that is not the case. I'm sure most of you know that a cellular connection is not going to solve this problem to the home. It's better than nothing, but it's not what's going to give our kids the learning abilities that they need. Not to mention 5G's broadcast radiuses are radically diminished from 4G, and if 4G isn't there already, there's absolutely not going to be a case for those guys to build 5G. So seeing that bill pass and then ultimately get changed to a way that inherently favored the incumbents was disappointing to me as well. And I've contacted our state senator and local assembly person as well who are helping on that, so maybe we should collaborate on that further. And if any of you are doing that, I'd like to invite you to contact me as well and see where we can consolidate efforts on fixing that, because it really should be adjusted to push this forward quicker. These incumbents have kind of stood in the way or taken large amounts of money and achieved a small amount of progress, in my opinion. I think Dane's company is a perfect example of what can happen from a effective entrepreneurial company versus a huge oligopoly that kind of runs an entire region. So for us, through like the big grant that CENIC has done, they've been able to connect so many schools compared to what you would see from the big providers doing with the same amount of money, and we were a part of doing those items. And the frustrating part is the upcoming Connect America Fund, which is fantastic and something we're going to be participating in for connecting rural parts of America. We're going to be going after all the rural parts of California, and it's our first round doing it, so I can't say what the expectations are. My expectations are always high, but it does provide money on an annual basis for 10 years to subsidize builds to bring internet of various speeds to these different locations. Luckily, the FCC recently overturned its decision to go back to 10 by 1 as a broadband standard and has raised it back to 25 by 3. For us, we'll be participating at 100 by 20 and offering services above that through fixed wireless. These areas I think will be very competitive on, because you'll see in the last go around there were companies like incumbents that received multiples of what they're offering now per household, and they only ended up delivering 10 by 1, and they basically twisted the FCC's arm to lower their requirements from 25.3 to 10 by 1. Otherwise, they would both have egg on their face and look bad. So that's not really a way I think that we're solving the problem, by using existing old copper infrastructure, and it seems almost like a profit house for them, for me. So for me, it's really passionate to close this digital divide. Obviously, there's being a private commercial company, there's a profit aspect that has to be taken into place. But I grew up in a very rural area and was one of the last places to receive internet. But the internet to me is the great equalizer. It's something that allows you, no matter where you are, to learn at your own pace, to learn what you want to learn, go out there, research, and make something of yourself, whether that's creating jobs, educating yourself, taking care of your own medical issues, learning. It's just something that should almost be a basic, human right, per se. So from there, I will turn it back to the next round of topics.
I want to start with a question to Dane, because he had a pretty remarkable insight. So Dane, talk a little bit about what's wrong with the mapping endeavor and what might be done to provide more precise truth about the conditions on the ground.
Yeah, one of the fundamental challenges, as we talk about subsidy programs and connecting the unconnected, is, to Rachelle's point, we don't know where folks are not connected. And we certainly hear from those who would like to be part of a digital future who don't have access, and they're frustrated by that. And so there are some squeaky wheels scattered around. There's a lot of folks, in regards to like adoption, they don't know what they're missing. They don't know that they need it, and they're not advocating for themselves. And so the FCC collects information in large census regions about availability. So they ask all infrastructure-based carriers, do you offer service, and how fast is the maximum speed within this large region? And if you can offer access within that large region, then check the box, that region is covered. And so the outcome is this really grossly inaccurate mapping about what actually is available. And but as a carrier, when you build infrastructure, like we're surveying every pole and taking measurements. We know the length of everything. We know how many homes there are that are served from every pole or every vault in the ground. And in order to plan for capacity, we need to know how many homes and how many units there are in every home. Is it a duplex? Is it a 30-unit apartment building? And so carriers have really extensive information about their physical infrastructure, but the regulators have not required that information be made available to the regulator. And so the FCC gathers this sort of gross overview information. The California regulator gets that same data, and unfortunately it makes it very difficult to make public policy decisions and to steer investment into the most underserved areas. So as a carrier ourselves, we feel like it is important to provide that information to regulators, and we would provide that information all the way down to a per parcel and per unit level with actual connected speeds. So when you're connecting someone with fiber, maybe it's consistently a gigabit, but customers that are connected with copper, you could guess how fast it would be, but if you actually have a customer in your network management, you know how fast that is. None of that information is provided to regulators today. So I think that's an interesting opportunity.
Any other comments about that particular topic?
Yeah, I'll say Dane had a really great point there that I was thinking of as well. So I know there's been big pushback from the big companies in regards to changing this policy. And the reason being is they don't want to see subsidy going to smaller providers. At least that's my opinion on it. But as Dane said, he could take a look in his system and find out via, if it's a copper DSL-based network, what speed that subscriber is actually getting it connected to. However, they don't want to report those speeds. So we're getting this very incomplete data where if one home in an entire census block is reported at the minimum threshold speed, it's deemed served. And as many of you probably know, if a copper loop goes up this way and down the other side, that could be the first home on the block, and then everyone else is left out behind. So it's really a play of these big corporate telecoms that are trying to keep their areas protected. And the data is available, so I think it really comes down to a regulatory readjustment and how we approach this with them, and maybe there's even some type of penalty or incentive system, one way or the other, of getting this data reported accurately and properly. So that would be, I think, one of the real first steps on then getting the funding to the areas that it needs to be to get this digital divide closed, and then really putting some more aggressive timetables, because the timetables that I'm seeing, like through the Connect America Fund, are almost laughable to me. We were originally going to go after 12 states. We're now going to go after 25 because they don't need us to break ground for 2.5 years. And normally for us, we would be a complete failure if that happened. So I just like to see a more aggressive approach in terms of pushing higher bandwidth, faster rollouts, and actual accurate reporting data like Dane spoke about.
Thank you. So you've talked a bit about the regulatory issues and a little bit about what legislative actions that folks in the room as individuals or as representatives of their various segments might take. What other strategies do you have, particularly when we think about the rural underserved communities that you might suggest?
So just building on what was, Skyler's comments and the problem of mapping alone, there is always missing in these equations sufficient leadership. Leadership that is at the administration, in the legislature, in the regulatory arena, to actually articulate the vision qualitatively and put to that quantitative goals or at least benchmarks. A good example, and I've spent more time on the methodology of mapping than I ever wanted to, and it all comes down to how big is the cell you're going to map on a shapefile. So I've argued over, is it 1,000 by 1,000 meters? Is it a census tract? And all of that information, the state of California or any state could say, thou shalt provide if you're going to have a contract with us. game over. I will tell you there is not leadership in any place with sufficient anatomy to make that pitch. So that is where I start. You have to actually set that goal. And that includes, now you asked the question about rural California. We actually assert, access to the internet is a 21st century civil right. So I've been that bold. We'll get into the pulpit. Others, I'm looking at Jared, who's done all of that from the library perspective. We've seen all you as pioneers. You've all done it before I could spell broadband. So I'm just here trying to, follow the lead. And in rural California, it is a matter of public safety, of economic development, of education, quality of life, and that is not articulated as policy for the state of California. We've got legislators, and we've managed to have, I think, a very remarkable bipartisan approach. I will not allow the internet to be captured by either party. So, our rural areas tend to be more represented by Republicans, and they want economic development, and they advocate for their constituents. The urban areas are tend to have more Democratic elected representatives, and they purport to talk about poor people. And of course, it's it's a travesty at the rate at which we're leaving behind the disadvantaged populations in this country and in California. But in order to get to rural California on the deployment side, it needs to be a policy that just recognizes what an investment high-speed internet access can be, a very significant return economically for what is quite honestly a modest subsidy. And as I've approached the dynamics of trying to thread the needle between what is the standard that the FCC has for CAF2 at 10.1 and opportunity for just fair competition, everybody that is a smaller competitor, new in the field, actually builds fiber. So all I have to do is get them at the table in order to be able to bid on areas. What we don't have either is transparency on what the incumbents are going to do. And they have pretty significantly attempted to negotiate safe harbor for 3-4 more years on CAF2. That's the newest, sort of debate we're now having in the regulatory, the promulgation of rules in the regulatory arena over implementation of the AB 1665. So it is having a vision that is declared in law that is the policy of California to help drive, or any state, to drive then the subsequent policy and dollar allocations.
Rachelle.
I could not agree with Sunne more. What I wanted to say is we have a rare opportunity. We have a brand new PUC commissioner, Martha Guzman Aceves, and she is going out to 4 areas of rural California, well, I guess 3 really, in this month. She'll be in Oroville, March 14th, Madera, March 16th, El Centro, March 28th, and Los Angeles, March 30th. And she's going to be there from 10 to 4, doing a public forum and a workshop on broadband. So we have an opportunity to get parents, schools, libraries, mayors, the head of the Boys and Girls Club, whoever needs broadband, can come and in 2 to 3 minutes talk to the commissioner who's going to make these decisions and the new ALJ. So I wanted to encourage any of you that might be near those areas, Oroville, Madera, El Centro, and Los Angeles, to please get people to those forums to talk to the commissioner about the need for broadband. I think that's really important.
Can I weigh in? You asked, what can be done to encourage deployment, and obviously I've got a personal interest in new deployment. So, you've got an incumbent, maybe there's some cable infrastructure, maybe there's some aging DSL infrastructure, and the schools, libraries, municipalities today are buying wide area network services. And, they may have T1s to a remote site, or they might have fiber to a school. One opportunity is to catalyze competition in your communities by engaging in purchasing decisions that result in new infrastructure deployment. So in other words, if you keep buying the same thing from the same people, nobody new comes in and builds any infrastructure. We have some great examples of this where we're bidding on a project in Ukiah to provide fiber to all municipal facilities. And so we would connect the police, the fire, the power generation, the airport, city hall, community centers. And what this creates is a new optical network backbone from one end of the city to the other. And that, by being the anchor user of that, what will happen next is economic development because that entire commercial corridor now has a new competitive fiber option. Now, if the schools that are in those neighborhoods are interested in, whether it's 10 gigabit lit service or a dark fiber infrastructure, they can catalyze the same thing. So they can keep buying the same service that they've had from an incumbent, or they can open the door to particularly dark fiber services, which cause new fiber to get built into their neighborhood. We see that as then a springboard to then serve the homes, so that the students, when they go home from the school, have another competitive choice. And obviously, I have a commercial interest in making all this happen, but I think that it has a real win-win positive outcome as well. So that's something that districts and county office of education, municipalities, research institutions, ag institutions can do in their market to encourage further deployment, which has these halo effect benefits.
And just to add on that, to what you said, Dane, in most jurisdictions, there will be no less than 3, often 5 or more separate contracts for IT from different departments, and you'll have an elected body, a board of supervisors, a city council, who are themselves individually very articulate champions for broadband or high-speed internet access or closing the digital divide, but nobody's talking to the departments at the management level. Nobody's talking to the folks at the permit desk. They haven't put into their general plans the policy that would actually provide the foundation for them legally to sustain a challenge if they're sued, if they're trying to facilitate the deployment of broadband. And you have to have a consolidation of the purchasing power. Because it's really underutilized in order to drive the kind of change and innovation that you're talking about.
Yeah, just as a point for folks who are unaware or who are not from California, the way cable franchise agreements used to be done in California was municipality by municipality, and so the government offices could negotiate to have their own network as a part of that agreement, and so these are called INETs. And the state of California had the idea that, well, actually they were given the idea by the cable providers, frankly, that these franchise agreements should be done at the state level. And that was successfully done, and so now the cable providers only have to negotiate with the state. And what that's effectively meant is that these INETs that the municipalities had for serving all parts of government have gone away, unless somebody negotiated a really good contract, and honestly, most of them did not. And so it is a sort of you could look at it as a dire circumstance or as a greenfield. I choose to look at it the latter way, as Dane was describing it. I have one more question. I want to open it up for the group. So I'm CEO of CENIC. There are probably some board members in here. There's certainly lots of our members here, and we're deeply involved in and focused on broadband for our constituents. That's our mission, after all. But many of you are looking at homes and businesses and other and government and other kinds of and healthcare and other kinds of entities. what would you like to see us do? What advice do you have for us?
Well, I guess this one isn't exactly advice, but Louis, you came to me with a brilliant idea some months ago in regards to consolidating different funding sources for a certain area. So we got together a proposal between our company and CENIC, and Louis was the head of putting this idea together, of looking for rural areas that are underserved and consolidating the funding that's available between E-rate for schools and libraries, telemedicine, federal rural funding, state rural funding, maybe municipal funding, and whatever other categories there may be there. So I worked with my general counsel, Melissa Slauson here, who was previously the PUC in California, and we reached out to Chairman Pai's office and gave them the ideas, and he flew out one of his advisors to my house to discuss it in more detail a few weeks later, and they were very receptive to the idea. So we finalized the proposal and flew out to D.C., met with every commissioner there and Chairman Pai's office, and had a very warm reception from everybody on it, bipartisan. So that was very positive. The negative to it was no one knew exactly how to bring all these different funding groups together yet. So we've been following up. It's been a couple of weeks since we put the formal proposal in their hands, but this is something that in our estimates could reduce not only build times, but build costs by 60 to 70% for these communities by aggregating this build for all these institutions, the community itself, all in one fell swoop. And it's one of the reforms I think that absolutely has to happen, and I'm going to hammer as hard as I can until someone tells me to screw off to try to get this through. So that was one of the really great idea, and any, I think, support behind that is beneficial.
So to follow up on that, I was just at the Shelby Strategic Retreat end of last week, and they were discussing this idea, and we were strategizing on how to get it done. The concept is we just build once, and it wouldn't be a healthcare build versus a school build versus a library build. We'd just build to the needy community, and any anchor could then use it, and it could also then be leveraged to residential users. So we do think it's doable, but it just, the way the funding is at the FCC is so siloed, it's definitely going to take a lot of effort. But they do look at California because we've done some very unique things here in the last 10 years. So I feel kind of moderately hopeful that it could be done.
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about the E-rate 2.0, sort of the modernization of E-rate that allows for dark fiber to be delivered. And I'll confess, being in the internet access business, the idea of lit services at one speed or another and one price or another is entirely shenanigans. And we see, schools where they're connecting an elementary school at 100 megabits, and a middle school at 250 megabits, and a high school at a gigabit, and they're paying more to go faster. And that is artificial. That is artificially constrained. And you guys work with technology a lot. Really, it's you log into the router, you change the speed in the interface, and it goes faster, right? So the idea that people would schools, institutions would pay differently to go different speeds is really the luxury of near monopoly. And the E-rate 2.0 rules recognize this and allow for a modernization where schools and libraries can leverage dark fiber over a much longer term. So when you're buying a artificially constrained X megabit product, you shouldn't contract for that for a very long period of time because it won't be enough X years from now. And so those contract durations are limited to short intervals. But with the reform of E-rate, schools can now obtain dark fiber for a much longer period of time. And because it's just dark fiber and it can be lit at any speed, today maybe that's 10 gigabits because that's cost effective. In the future, it will be wave division multiplexing and hundreds of gigabits. With that same physical infrastructure, you can deploy whatever capacity is necessary. And what the procurement rules recognized was that this would yield also a cost efficiency, because by buying this infrastructure over a very long period of time and then lighting it at whatever speed is necessary, you can achieve a lower total cost of ownership over a long period of time. And so looking at the capabilities that E-Rate 2.0 brings, I think create an interesting opportunity for deployment into communities of new infrastructure. That infrastructure then can be used for whether it's small cell backhaul or residential service or municipal or enterprise services. The key is getting more infrastructure, physical infrastructure built.
If I could just add on to the comments that everybody's made of the institutional silos and the inertia that has to be overcome in these institutions to cooperate, to pool the dollars. While it's not easy, it is possible to actually put multiple strands of dollars into a given project. The missing ingredient usually is who's going to convene those parties and provide the leadership in order to do that. What we attempted to do in our flawed Internet for All Now Act bill, AB 1665, was actually to say now it is the law that the Public Utilities Commission in California is responsible for achieving the goal of 98% deployment by region. So that's a very important clarification in California, because we're so big, you can mathematically get to 98% of California and still have much of rural California not served at all. So it is now by region. The way in which they are to be helped is by the regional consortia that actually are funded. These are self-defined, voluntarily defined groupings of counties. We have 58 counties in California that define regions, and it is that 98% goal by those voluntarily defined regions that is to be achieved. And those regional consortia, by statute, are supposed to be putting everybody around the table and saying, what are you going to contribute? Where are the public assets? What is a public asset? It is a right-of-way that a county, a city, a state, the federal government owns. It is infrastructure that might be light poles or traffic facilities that a jurisdiction has. It may be a building on which you can put a tower. Those are all public assets that the public sector needs to bring to the table that no one company can easily do on their own. That really is on the public side if we want to close the digital divide. And they need to be looking at the challenge of, so what are reasonable scenarios and preferred scenarios for getting to 98%? The way the process has worked up till now in California, and actually at the FCC to a certain extent, is it is very passive, and it is incrementally driven by what does somebody want to propose as a project, as opposed to here's what we need to get done, who's going to help us, and it will take usually more than one company. So then the role of CENIC. Here's what you ask, and I want to be really careful not to get you outside your core business, although I think you're such a great asset. I always want to look to seeing how much can we get as other benefits in California from CENIC. First of all, Louis, you and your board should be asking the regional consortia, what are you doing and how can CENIC help? And every time you're going to do a project, reaching out and saying to that regional consortium in the area and the PUC, do you want anything else to happen? So just really forge that conversation. I think the second thing that makes a lot of sense is that you're trying to, starting with the original members of CENIC, the research institutions, higher education institutions where you need high bandwidth, is looking at, as you have had during this conference, all those wonderful applications that could be even better if we had universal connectivity. I mean, just any researcher wants to have as large a universe of collecting data as possible, and that's a benefit. And if we had in California the 31% of the folks that are being left behind that are unconnected or underconnected that I worry about on a daily basis, actually at their full potential, we'd have so much more brain power in our research institutions. We'd be attracting a whole lot more venture capital into this state. So that's how I view it. I think I'm not going to put a burden on you to be the convener of all this, but if you're doing any project, please ask everybody else what they can do to add to it, and vice versa.
Great. Thank you. So those of you from other states ought to be rightfully envious that we have such a great group of colleagues to work with from other public sector organizations and private sector organizations, and it really it's one of the great joys of doing this work here is to work with folks like this and to find common cause and people who have such passion around this, because they're hard problems to solve. And the entities that we're up against are built to wear you out, right? And so it really takes extraordinary tenacity as well as vision in order to persevere. And these folks have that. And so with that, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists. And I thought that questions would be much better with a little snack and a glass of wine. So you can follow up there. There's a reception out there, and you can query the panelists there. How's that sound?